Hello, Year 11. This is going to be a screencast which focuses on the theme of brutality. Now, mine will be a little bit different to the other teachers, but that's okay. Let's embrace it and just go with it. So, the first thing is to go over what the intention of this podcast is and what you need to get out of it, which is your success criteria. So, to use this screencast video to understand the theme of brutality within the memoir Night, to identify examples of brutality within the text, analysing them in thoughtful detail, and I can explain how and why brutality is explored in the text. I can identify specific examples of brutality and the ways in which these are intended to contribute to the narrative and to impact the reader. We've got here just an image that I've pulled off the web, and it's of the officers in the concentration camps and the throwing of babies into piles of flames. And this is similar to the image or what Eli would have witnessed on his first night in the concentration camp. All right, so one of the legacies of the Holocaust is the sheer scale of one group of people's inhumanity towards other groups of people. So that is the German Nazis against the Jews, the Gypsies, people who were disabled, people who were so homosexual, anybody who was considered an undesirable were put into these concentration camps. Their rights were taken away and they were stripped of their humanity. So their identity was taken away. They were given a number, pajamas. They weren't fed very well. They were in a constant state of fear. And so this book is exploring the way that one group of people behave so inhumanely towards another group and the consequences of that. So defining brutality in your book, which you should have ruled up. So you want to have the heading of brutality. And the first thing you want to do is write a definition. So the definition is savage physical violence and great cruelty. There are some synonyms, and it's important to have a range of synonyms at your disposal if you are doing the brutality question, because in this essay, you want to show that you're sophisticated in your writing and that you can use or command a range of vocabulary to support your analysis. So I've listed a few here. We've got savagery, cruelty, inhumanity, viciousness, barbarity, wickedness, harshness, ruthlessness, atrocity, vileness. Now there are plenty more that you can come up with. Despicable, disgusting, deplorable, these kinds of words. Go and look at your thesaurus. That's what it's for, and see if you can find some more to add to the list. The more you have, the better you're able to really accurately describe what is happening in the text and how it is brutal and shows what is the very worst of human behavior, which is the question that we're focusing on. Now, there is this speech. I'm not going to play this one, but it is interesting, and this is Elie Wiesel. I think he's accepting an award, and he talks about the perils of indifference, and what that means is the problems or the issues with being indifferent, which means that you don't care either way. You're not having an opinion on an issue. So those people who are indifferent, for example, in the Holocaust, were the Germans, who neither supported the Nazis, but nor were they Jews. So they were free individuals within that country, and they failed to do anything. Many of them failed to do anything to protect the Jews who were being persecuted. And then you've got the world, who failed to act. It is well documented that governments knew about what was going on in Nazi Germany, but did not act to protect those people. And considering the sheer scale of what was going on, that's horrifying in and of itself. But I do want to look at this video, and I really, really encourage you to take the time to find this video on YouTube. It's called The Final Solution, Jewish Life on the Brink of Death. We're just going to look at a short part of it. But this is from Yad Vashiva, how do you say it? Yad Vashem, which is a group based in Israel who are responsible for and have a huge role in documenting the testimonies of survivors and collecting archival evidence and things like that. So videos, photos, diaries, objects, etc. So I'm just going to watch a short part of this, which highlights the brutality of life in the camp. It's only going to be a couple of minutes, so hopefully we can see and hear it. Let's see.
Giving the victims a name, a space, rather than focusing on numbers, evokes a sense of empathy. They become real people with emotions, with feelings, with aspirations. Ellis Lewin was 12 years old when he was deported from the Lodz ghetto to Auschwitz-Birkenau with his father, his mother, and his sister.
Auschwitz-Birkenau, located in Poland, was the largest extermination and concentration camp set up by the Nazis. Historians estimate that up to 1.3 million people were murdered in the camp, and the vast majority of them were Jews, perhaps up to 1.2 million. Almost all of the Jews sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau were murdered immediately upon arrival. A minority of them were taken into the camp to perform forced labor and become inmates.
When we arrived to Auschwitz, the minute they opened the wagon, just total, complete misery, beatings and screamings and beatings and barking of dogs and growling of dogs. And we were just holding on to each other, and I don't know, within minutes, my mother and my sister were dragged to one side, and I was dragged with my dad to go to another side. And my dad hollered to her, "You take care of her, I'll take care of him."
Ellis focuses on the pace and on the sounds. He talks about the shouting, the barking, the yelling. He talks about the pace. Everything happened fast. There was a rhythm to this whole chaotic process. The purpose behind this was to confuse them, to make them feel like they don't know what's going to happen next. This was the system. In Ellis's testimony, he describes the rupture, the dismantling, the tearing apart of everything. Families are being torn from one another. At the same time, we see this attempt of continuity, the attempt to cling on to family. So Ellis's father says to his mother, "You take care of her, I'll take care of him." This is an attempt to continue in a world that's constantly fracturing, rupturing, and falling apart. The tension and struggle between rupture and continuity is something we see reoccurring in so many stories of Jews in the Holocaust, in ghettos and in camps.
My dad threw me in front of him. The one thing you didn't want is for the Germans to see that you were holding on to your child, because that was the whole idea, is to break up the family, murder the family. That was the genocide of the whole thing. So by not identifying that this is your child, there was a little bit of an edge you had to possibly survive.
All right, I'm going to pause it there. But I think that's a good video to go and have a look at. But it just emphasizes the experience, or puts a bit more of a face and a name and a description to what it was like on that first night. So you can think about that as one of the examples of the brutality in the text. So let's first look at what are the most obvious examples of brutality in the text, because that's, of course, the place you're going to start. And I've listed a few here. So you can add notes to your exercise book as you are listening to this. The slides will be available as well, but you should write these down. You need to practice handwriting, because in the exam you need to write for 3 hours. So you should practice strengthening your hand muscles and trying to put this information into a meaningful way that you will remember and understand. So the first act of violence is the violence Moishi witnesses and reports to the Jews in Saget. It is so extreme and dispassionate that they don't believe him. So what he witnesses in the Galician forest is the Gestapo using infants as target practice for their own pleasure. They did not have any reason to do it. They just chose to do it because they were trying to eradicate a group of people, and for their own fun, they thought it would be entertaining to use babies as targets. That image is so horrific that the Jews struggle to even believe Moishi. They can't comprehend that this is possible. Despite seeing it with his own eyes, the violence is so extreme that Elysia has a hard time believing it could possibly be real. He thinks it is a nightmare. So this refers to the first night in the concentration camp. We see Elie witness the burning of the babies in the pit they're on fire. You see the truck backing up to that pit and dumping more bodies in there. You see people being beaten, and think about what that gentleman said in the video about the dogs barking, the fear, the shouting, the yelling, the beatings. All of this is going on, and you can imagine the kind of feeling this creates inside the Jews who have no idea what is going on and do not know where they are or what is going to happen to them next. Then you've got the men in control can afford to be violent simply because they happen to be angry and want to lash out at something. It's a senseless violence that serves no purpose. So for this, you could think about the guard Idek. Now, if you are looking for page numbers for these characters, use the handout from Miss Spence. If you do not have that, come and see me and I can get you a copy, but I will make sure that Miss Sparrow's class gets a copy of it as well. So you've got Idek. There are other guards who are indiscriminate in their violence, which means they just lash out for no particular reason. They just feel the need themselves or can't control themselves. So we've got Idek the capo and the way that he punishes Elie for him witnessing Idek having sex with a Polish girl. You've also got the German SS officers who use the public hangings and the threat of death to keep prisoners frightened and submissive. There is a particularly important hanging, and that is of the young Pippel. You can find that later in the book. Let me see if I can find the page reference. It is page 63 through to page 65. And that's a particularly important moment because the brutality of the act of hanging that young boy who stays up on the noose and does not die because he is not heavy enough to immediately have his neck broken when the noose, when he falls from the chair, and instead suffers a very slow and painful death lolling about on that noose as all the thousands of prisoners walk by. You also have the SS officers who use the threat of death and examples of murder to frighten the prisoners into following orders. Although the SS are following their boss's orders to shoot the prisoners that can't keep up, they also gain pleasure from the violence. So, for example, this is during the death marches, and Elie notes the fact that if you fell out of line, if you weren't able to keep up, you were simply shot. There was absolutely no room for any kindness or humanity or any thoughtfulness about the fact that you might be struggling running in snow without shoes in simply these thin pajamas in the middle of a German winter. They didn't care. They just shot you. So think about the absolute inhumanity of those particular acts. And in some cases, they enjoyed what they were doing. And then you've got on the train, so they've done their march, now they're moved on to cattle carts and they're going into central Germany because the Germans know that the Soviets are coming and the end of the war is near, but they need to get all of the Jews back into Germany so that could, one, either finish the final solution, or two, use them for labor to continue their efforts within Germany. But on the train, a passerby, a worker in a town that they pass through, throws in some breadcrumbs for his own entertainment and watches as the prisoners in the cattle car battle it out for the food. And you see a son kill his father simply for a scrap of bread. That happens on page 101. And it's a particularly frightening moment, but shows how much the bonds between family have deteriorated. And again, that links to what the gentleman on the Yad Vashem video said about how the Nazis were attempting to disrupt and fracture those family bonds. That was an act of brutality in and of itself, to destroy the bonds we have with each other so that we are all in competition and we will kill or be killed in order to survive, regardless of any relationship we might have had with those people before the war. Finally, the SS officer beats Eli's harmless and ill father simply because he is annoyed that Eli's father isn't silent. Now that happens in the final couple of chapters. So we're looking at about page 109 to about 112. So have a look there. And it says, this is yet another powerful and horrifying example of senseless, cruel violence. So Eli's father is simply beaten because he's so helpless and he's just annoying people. They can't stand it. And that may be a reaction to their own fear that Eli's father is just simply making them feel more afraid for what could happen to them. And so they need to keep him quiet. Another example that I haven't touched on here, and I'm not sure why I didn't include it, is Mrs. Schachter on the train. Now, that is an example of the Jews being cruel to each other. So, if you have a look on page, hold on, let me find it. From page 23 onwards, 24, we see Mrs. Schachter introduced on page 24, and that goes through to page 28. She says, "Fire, fire, I see fire." Nobody in the cable car, or the cattle car, sorry, sees the flames that she claims to be seeing. And at first they just try to calm her down, think she's a crazy woman. It happens again. They bundle her up, cover her mouth and tie her hands together so that she can't move anymore, and just trying to calm her. She breaks free. This time they beat her. She breaks free again, and they beat her again. And so that is how the Jews were reduced to behave in a way that was animal-like, the way that the Germans had always thought they were. The Nazis presented them as vermin and animals, and they weren't human. So therefore, they had lived up to, by treating each other in this way, the Jews had lived up to that stereotype, and they had become the animals. All right, other examples. We've got terribly afraid and treated inhumanely themselves. The Jews are even violent to each other. So we've got Mrs. Schachter, so I did include it. There you go. They hurt her because she amplifies their fear of what is to come. Her reaction causes grave panic in the cattle car, and they don't know how to deal with that. So the only way that they think they can deal with it is to shut her up, and that means to beat her. And there are applaud. People congratulate those who took the action to keep her quiet, and that illustrates the kind of deterioration in values of what is morally or the humane way to treat another person, and it becomes acceptable to treat them in a violent manner in order to protect yourself. So it's kind of about survival. Rabbi Elihu and his son. So his son abandons him. This is right at towards the end, when they're on their death march, about between sort of chapter 7 and 9, I would say. Let's have a look here. All right, page 91. I apologize for all these pauses. I should have written them down. But page 91, you've got the rabbi coming to see Eli, and he says, "Have you seen my son?" And Eli says, "No." And then he suddenly remembers that, yes, he did. And he saw that his father was being left. He saw that the son saw that his father, Rabbi Elihu, was being left behind, and still the son ran on. And in that moment, Eli says a prayer to God, and he says, "Please do not let that happen to me. Please do not let me abandon my father." And there's also the reflection that the fact that Rabbi and his son have been for 2 years, they've done everything together and helped each other, but it is in this final march, because they don't know the war's coming to an end for them. They don't know what the next day is going to hold, and it's every man for himself. So the son abandons his father. All right, but you need to have a but paragraph. If we are going to talk about all this awful inhumanity and how people respond to it or why they are inhumane, we also need to have our third body paragraph as a but paragraph, and that is it entirely hopeless, or are there moments of hope and kindness where this idea that all the Jews have been turned into these horrible and inhumane individuals who are only caring about themselves, or are there exceptions? And there are many exceptions, and a couple of them are noted here. So you've got the young Pole who meets them on the first night, page 41, go and have a look at it. And he says, have faith 1,000 times, have faith. And he says that in order to survive, they must help each other. That is a necessary element in survival. And he says, hell does not last forever. And he says, we are all brothers and share the same fate. The same smoke hovers over all our heads. Help each other. This is the only way to survive. So, and Eli says those were the first human words he heard. So this is a moment of hope for him, because before now it's been the first night he has had the selection where he's been separated from his parents, or his mother and his sisters, sorry. He's witnessed the flames, consuming the bodies in the pits. He has thought that he was about to walk into a crematorium because that's what people were telling him was happening, and they were marching straight for it. He's witnessed the smoke hovering across the camp and the omnipresent fear that smoke brings. And so finally there's this moment of kindness. So it gives him hope that maybe he can survive and things will be okay. You have the French girl, so page 52 and 53. Now, the whole time she's been in the camp, she has pretended that she cannot speak German, and this she has done to protect herself, to claim that she is mistakenly in there and that she shouldn't in fact be a prisoner because she is French. But Eli's beaten because he saw Edek having sex with a young Polish girl. But the French girl goes over and comforts Eli, who's kind of cringed up in the corner after his beating, and she pats him on the head with a towel, stares at him for a moment, and then says in perfect German that he shouldn't lose hope, and that he should save his energies because, they will survive, they will carry on. So have a look at that moment there. Then we've got the act of writing the book, his testimony, and hope that humanity will learn. So the whole book, the fact that he's even written this book, suggests that it isn't hopeless, because there is a lesson to be learned and we can learn it and not repeat it. And so that is why he writes. Finally, we've got the father and son on page 89. Let me have a look at this. Ignore that. Let's carry on. All right, so we've got an essay question. I'm going to frame the rest of the time in my screencast to that, or around this idea. And it says, infants were tossed in the air and used as targets for the machine guns. To what extent does night reveal the very worst of human behavior? So the first thing you need to do is think about what are the key words, what are synonyms for them, what other questions do they need to be asked. Now, I've done this with my class on the board, but you can do this in your book. Just set up a blank page, put this in the middle, and start writing all around it like a bit of a brainstorm. What is the context of the quote? Who is speaking? It's Moishi. He's speaking to the Jews of Saget, telling them about what he saw in the Galician forest. What impact does this image have on the author, Wiesel? What does it have on you? Why has Wiesel included this particular quote? What does he want to show you? Are there other quotes that are similarly shocking in the memoir, or other moments? What links can you draw? So those are questions for you to answer, and answering them differently is a good thing, because you want your essay to be different to the people around you. If we read the same essay, it's not very interesting, and it makes it harder to do as well. So if you write something that's a little bit different and has your own spin on it, that's really good. And that is likely, as long as you can back it up with evidence from the book, likely to see you do better in your results. All right, then we've got to what extent. What evidence can you find in the text to prove that night reveals the very worst of human behavior? And I'm going to explore some of those in a moment. And are there any exceptions to this? And that's what I mean about the but paragraph. Are there examples or times where there are moments of kindness and hope despite the overwhelming cruelty. We've got a few key words, for example, reveal. Reveal means to show something that is covered or hidden. You've got some synonyms: uncover, strip away, expose, unwrap, disclose, illustrate, explore, etc. You could also talk about human behavior, what that means, and we talked about it being acts, thoughts, just the way people generally behave and how they are around others. And so you need to think about, when are there instances of brutality and inhumanity? Who or what is responsible for this behavior? What do these moments show us about the perpetrators and the victims? What do we learn about each side based on what happens and when these cruel moments of behavior occur? And what are the consequences? Does violence being enacted against a character make them lose faith, or do they decide to give up, or does it make them feel more powerful and they want to fight back? For example, the French girl giving Eli hope that his day will come. He just needs to keep on fighting. And finally, Wiesel's memoir shows readers how the brutality of the Nazis reduced the Jews to being animal-like. So that's the very worst of human behavior, and we've talked about that point already, so I'm going to leave that one there, but you might just want to note it down. So you should have a page drawn up, and you should have answered some of these questions here and had a brainstorm. Do it with another student or a group of you, because you can get a lot more ideas if you put your heads together and really unpack what's being asked of you and what examples you can draw on to help you answer that question. You should 100% talk about this quote in one of the paragraphs, probably the first one I would suggest, as a way to frame the essay, because that quote is significant. So you need to know the context of it, and then you need to explain how it reveals the very worst of human behavior. So the next set of slides, or what I've got for the kind of remainder, are topic sentences, and then how I would approach evidencing or proving that argument that's made in the topic sentence. So I haven't given you an introduction on here, but possibly I'll provide something like that later. But here are some body paragraph ideas. So you could go backwards. You could write your body paragraphs and then insert those ideas into an introduction at a later point, because it's really important just to get in there and have a crack at writing body paragraphs. The more practice you get and the more range you can show in different paragraphs, the better chance you will have of remembering that information and being able to interpret it in a really insightful way in the SAC, and in a way that actually addresses the question you're being asked on the day, and not just addresses the question that you practice on at home. Because that is the difference between your kind of C maybe to an A. Anywhere in there can be how well students are managed to address the prompt that they're given on the day versus their ability to regurgitate the exact same essay they did in their practice SAC, which is not necessarily going to best address the prompt on the day. You need to readjust your paragraphs to suit that. So let's start with this one. Wiesel's memoir is dominated by an overwhelming sense of horror at the methods of Nazi control and cruelty. Sorry, that doesn't make sense. Wiesel's memoir is dominated by an overwhelming sense of horror as the methods of Nazi control and cruelty are fully revealed by author and survivor Elie Wiesel. So, you need to talk about the moments that dominate and overwhelm the reader and Eli. So, I've chosen 3 here. They are not the only 3, but they are 3 you could talk about. So, you've got the first instance, the Gestapo's lack of passion and haste as they used infants and babies for target practice. This is from chapter 1, and this is Moishi telling the Jews of Saget about what he saw. So you would explain this quote, and you would use that quote from back here. Infants were tossed in the air, in addition to the way that they did it without passion or haste. You would talk about the reaction of the Jews of Saget, and then how the reader should react to that, and how that reveals the beginnings of the horrors that the Jews are about to witness will witness in the concentration camp. Then you move to the concentration camp, and you might say this violence is amplified within the context of the concentration camp, or it continues to escalate in the context of the concentration camp. So you've got Idek as an agent for the Nazis, uses indiscriminate beating of prisoners seemingly for his own pleasure. So what does this behavior suggest about life in concentration camps, the Nazi machinery, and the value they place on human lives? So they don't care about human lives. They are not seen as valuable. They are worthless. They are simply a number and part of the systematic eradication of a group of people. They're not seen as kind of a face with a story, like the lady in the Yad Vashem video asked us to see them as. Finally, you can then transition to talking about the hanging of the young Pipel. So you might say that this kind of culminates in, or the climactic moment in which the true horrors of the Nazi machinery is revealed is the hanging of the young Pipel. How do those people who are in the yard witnessing this, so the prisoners, how do they react? And you could talk about the way that Elie describes the soup that night. It tasted of corpses. And how should the reader react to this? What are we supposed to think? How does that fully reveal to us the inhumanity of the Nazis and the cruelty of their acts against the Jewish people? Another paragraph. Whilst the Nazis and their supporters are the most obvious examples of the very worst of human behaviour, readers are also forced to consider the ways in which the humanity of the Jews is chipped away. This gradual deterioration leads many to revert to their base instincts, sacrificing their morality in pursuit of their own survival. So, for example, you might talk about Madame Schachter on the train. What does this moment reveal about the consequences of the Germans' treatment of the Jews thus far? The edicts, which means the laws that have been put in place, their movement to their ghettos, and then they're forced into cattle cars to go to Auschwitz. So they don't know what's happening to them. They're very afraid, and they decide to beat her. So you could talk about that. And then you say, how does Elie feel about this at the time? And later, his father makes a comment on page 34. He remembers, or he asks Elie, does he remember Madame Schachter? What does that moment reveal for them? They have the knowledge of hindsight now. They know what's happening in the camp, and so they realize that there was some truth to what Madame Schachter was saying, despite the fact that only she saw the flames. She warned them, but they did not listen to her, much like Moishi. You've also got the revert to the base instinct, and we talked about this before, but the son who kills his father for a scrap of bread, that's on page 101. And later in life, Wiesel is again reminded of this moment. So just after that, he talks about a woman who throws coins out of a boat at some native children on an island somewhere while she's on a cruise, I think. And they attack each other to get the coins. And is he suggesting that we've learnt anything, or that we are still ignorant and inhumane? And whilst we're not ourselves reverting to our base instincts by doing that, we're forcing other people to revert to their base instincts, to sacrifice their morality to pursue their own survival, because these children are obviously fighting for the money in order to live and get by, if that makes sense to you. All right, then we've got silence is a deadly weapon that the weak rely on. Knight illustrates the fatal consequences that silence had on the Jewish people. So silence is a really important theme, and I think this is a great paragraph, and I really like the way that Miss Spence has spoken about this in her podcast or her screencast, so you can have a listen to that too. I will put a link to it in the slides at the end. So it's first mentioned in the foreword, and Elie says he must write this book as a testimony because to forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. And what he means is to forget. So if we were silent and we did not speak about them, then we would be killing them a second time. We will have failed their memory and the possibility of who they could have been. And then it says, so why, you've got to ask yourself, why has Elie written this memoir? So you could talk about the importance of testifying. What is his purpose? He wants to teach us so that this never happens again. What does the above quote, so this bit here, suggest about his purpose? So add that to what I've already said. He also notes that the world was silent, and that's here. So silence is a deadly weapon. So you could talk about how the world failed to act, and he realizes that with hindsight, that the world failed to act despite the fact that they knew what was happening. They still failed to act. All right, and then you could go on to talk about the first night in the camp, Never Shall I Forget, which is on page 34. Mrs. Hando discusses this particular passage in some detail in her hindsight screencast, which you can look at, but a few notes I have on it is that there are two words repeated throughout this passage, and they are silence and night. Why? What is Eli attempting to convey to his readers? He's trying to emphasize the importance or the horror of silence, and that is God's silence, the world's silence. And he's also trying to emphasize that night is a time in which all these horrors occurred, and that's why his book is entitled Night, as if this whole period is one long dark night for him. Not something that he necessarily wants to forget, but something that he remembers as a time of chaos and fear, which is what night is associated with. That speech on page 34 is actually the inversion or the flipping of a Psalm 150 from the Bible, and in that actual psalm it is a praising of God, and it's a proclamation of how great he is, but Eli uses it as an accusation. He holds God to account for what he has done and blames him for his silence and inability to protect the Jewish people, the chosen people. But one question I want you to think about is, do you think that people are silenced, their failure to act up here, when I said the world is silent, do you think their failure to act is because of their own fear, and does that justify it? Or is it still an example of the very worst of human behavior? Finally, Eli is silent when his own father is being beaten. At times he even blames his father for incurring the wrath of the guards. That causes him guilt, which shows that he's still human and still cares for his dad. But the fact that his immediate reaction is to blame his father for the fact that he's getting beaten shows that the Nazis have been successful in destroying that bond between him and his father to some extent. It is not perfect or the same as what it was before they arrived. Moishi the Beetle first introduces the decline of humanity as he recounts the horrific ordeals he encountered and subsequently came to warn all the Jews of Saget about. So you could just focus on Moishi for a paragraph. That would be okay if you dealt with it in a kind of detailed and analytical way. So you might talk about initially the Gestapo and the way that they killed the infants. You need to explain how that shows the decline of humanity, what that illustrates for both the Jews of Saget, for the reader, and for Moishi. How does he react? What's his response? He comes back to Saget and he warns the Jews, but they reject him. So this rejection and this treatment of him as a madman, which is what they accuse him of being, causes him great humiliation and pain, and he no longer has faith in God or in the Jews because they have both failed him. And so how does this moment highlight the fact that it was not only the Nazis who were inhumane, so too were the Jews? So I've pointed this example as the beginning of the Jews' slow descent into inhumanity. Not all of them, obviously, but this is a powerful moment in which the Jews fail to appreciate the reality that they are facing, and as such, or in their in an attempt to kind of counteract the fear that they feel about what Moishi said, they just pretend that he's mad because that reassures them that what they are doing is right and that he is in the wrong and they are safe. But Moishi comes back at the end and he says, "I warned you," and then he runs off. We don't know what the fate of Moishi is, simply that he ran away after reminding the Jews of his warning. With hindsight, the depth of their cruelty is revealed. So it's only after they get to Auschwitz and they see what's going on that they realize that Moishi was telling them the truth, and that they had been very naive and had failed to escape when they possibly could have because of their failure to believe him. So you might talk about, if you wanted to do this one, you could talk about like violence in a chronological way, so how it escalates and gets worse throughout the book. And this would be the first point, the beginning of the inhumanity of the Jewish people towards each other. All right, even as the Jews were being transported from Szeged to the camps in Poland, the suffering and fight for survival begins. So you might focus on the Mrs. Schachter on the train, and there's also at the beginning of, I think it's chapter 3, which is on page, no, sorry, chapter 2. On page 23, it talks about the young couple who fail to show their morals and behave in a way that's appropriate in public, begin to touch each other. And you might talk about this as also the beginning of their fight for survival, that they don't care about who sees what, and they're starting to lose that sense of what is right and wrong in company, because they just want to survive, and they're comforting each other in that way. All right, the events on the train soon pale into insignificance, becoming merely an introduction into the humanity which prevails throughout night. So the beating of Mrs. Schachter is not the most horrifying thing. It's kind of quite innocent almost in comparison to what then goes on later. And what goes on later is the first night at the camp, never shall I forget. And I'm not going to repeat myself, but that's on an earlier slide. You've got the first selection, men to the left, women to the right. And that is the beginning of chapter 3, if you want to have a look at that. And it says, what impact does this have on Eli? What does it suggest about the fate of the women and the children? Sorry, I'm going to fix up the spelling there, or the grammatical structure. So what impact does that have on Eli? How does it reveal the inhumanity and the brutality of the guards? Because it's 8 simple short words spoken quietly, indifferently, without emotion. That's on page 29. That's a powerful moment. It's a very brief moment, but it's a powerful moment, which, even though they conducted in a calm manner, reveals a very, or is soon to reveal a very awful truth, in that the women are about to be, most of them, directed to the crematorium, and the men are to face a selection. All right, then you've got the vision of the bodies burning, being dumped into the flames from a truck tray. Explain how this image affects Eli. How would the reader react to this image upon first reading? The flames are an important symbol here. What do they suggest? So this is the beginning of the extinguishing of Eli's faith. It begins to it's having chinks in his armor of his faith, for example, because what he sees, he just cannot reconcile with a God. He doesn't know how a God can exist if he allowed this to go on. There are many other examples of the events that show much greater inhumanity than what happened on the train. You've got Edek, the son killing his father, Rabbi's son abandoning him, Shlomo being beaten, the Pippolt being hung, or even the death marches which occur in the final few chapters of the novel. The relentless and purposeless way in which the SS attempt to destroy every ounce of humanity within the Jews' prison population takes a horrific toll. So Edek, as an agent for the Nazis, indiscriminate beating of the prisoners, seemingly for his own pleasure, and also the hanging of the young Pipel. The relentless means it just goes on and you can never escape it. And purposeless means there is no reason or rhyme behind what they're doing. They do it purely because they want to. And so they use the young Pipel as a warning for the others, but it still seems a horrific blow to hang a child in front of them. And the fact that this kind of activity continues on begins to impact Eli's faith and his father's faith, and the other faith of other men, for example, Akiba Druma, and there's another rabbi as well who I can't think of right now. I'm going to skip that one. All right, and then a final topic sentence, but I haven't written anything underneath this one, but it's for your own interest. Due to the brutality of the Germans and the effects of dehumanization that Jews themselves. Due to the brutality of the Germans and the effects of dehumanization, the Jews themselves become brutal as they allow their instincts of self-preservation to overwhelm them. I'll correct that on the final draft, but that's a possible question or topic sentence that you might use. Then you need to frame it around these ideas. All right, now the but paragraph. So, despite the overwhelming sense of despair, we'll go back. You need to select 3 topic sentences from this first part, 2 to 3 from this first part to use in your essay. Then you want to select at least 1 from this section to have as your 3rd or 4th, depending how many you're writing, paragraph to kind of counteract or to illustrate that you can see both sides of the argument, that the book shows the very worst, but that there are still moments of hope. So, despite the overwhelming sense of despair at the dehumanization and murder of the Jews, there are moments in which Elie conveys a positive image of humanity. And that is the older inmate who tells Elie and his father to lie when they first get there. And I've got an incomplete sentence here, but let's have a look. It is in chapter 3, and it is on page 30, and he says you need to say that you're 18, and he tells Shlomo that he needs to say that he's 40 because they will pass selection. They have a better chance of passing selection if they meet the age criteria that the guards are looking for. Elie also lies and says that he's a farmer because he knows that's probably going to benefit him. We also see, like the gentleman on the Yad Vashem video said, that Elie and his father separate because they know that they need to be apart in order to get through. The Nazis don't want to see that connection between father and son. All right, then we've got the young Pole, have faith 1,000 times, have faith. And these are the first human words that Elie hears on the first night, and that is on page 41. Then you've got the French girl who puts herself in danger, and that is on page 53. Then you've got Elie and Shlomo during the death marches, and they protect each other at night time and make sure they don't fall asleep and stay asleep in the snow in the abandoned buildings that they sleep in while they're marching back towards Germany. These are a number of other topic sentences that you can use, so just pause and jot down whatever you need, but I'm not going to go into those in too much detail. I'm going to put an essay plan or attach one to this. I've started it. I'm just not finished quite yet. I've got a potential introduction here. Now this is a bit more simplistic than what I've looked at in the slides so far, but it still doesn't hurt. And this one's for the chronological, the increasing violence. So you would say the first instances of brutality can be found in the stories Moishi the Beadle shares with the people of Saget. However, Wiesel reveals that violence begets violence. The oppression of the Jews of Saget, their forced removal to concentration camps such as Auschwitz, and the violence they face from Nazi guards provokes a deterioration in morals and the Jews and the infliction of violence by Jews themselves. So your first paragraph might be about Moishi in Saget, and then the second one would be about how the violence of the Gestapo before that, and then the treatment in the ghettos and things like that of the Jews, how that provokes them to deteriorate in their morals and they behave inhumanely. So you talk about Mrs. Shachter, and then in the camps, you know, the abandonment of fathers, etc. Fathers and sons, you know, connections being lost. Then you have your final but paragraph. Although Wiesel bears witness to some of the very worst moments of human behavior, there are times in which the prisoners who surround him maintain their compassion and humanity, despite the horrors they face. And that's where you'd explore some of those examples back here. There are many more than that, but they're just a few that I wanted to touch on. All right, I've got a list here of some other resources that you might like to use. Dictionary definition, thesaurus. Schmoop's a really useful, just kind of a review website, which has, you know, good quotes and theme discussion, spark notes, and then this one here, I'm not 100% sure. Let's have a look what that is. All right, survival versus humanity. So you can have a look at that and see how the fight for survival influenced the way that they behaved in order to survive. All right, and then I've got one other question here to think about if you were wanting to write on a different topic or to practice. Throw out all the dead, outside all the corpses. Wiesel uses night to demonstrate the worst of human nature. Discuss. So it's quite similar, but you would focus on this quote within your first paragraph. And that's a quote from towards the end of the book when they are moving back into Germany. They're in the cattle cars and people are dying daily in these cattle cars, and they just need to throw out the bodies to free up the space. And Elie says that 100 people got into the cars, 80 people got in and only 12 got out at the end. So we're talking about 80% of the people dying or something like that. My math skills are not awesome, but there you go. All right, that is it. If you have any questions, you can come and see me. I hope this was helpful. I'm sorry if I rabbited on too much, but there you go. Better to have more than not enough. Any questions, come and see me and I'll leave it there.